I defeated all the fighters in the original storyline of Lionheart, starting with the first fighter in New York City, the dock worker, and then I had to save my brother Francois, but after that I won against the rest of the fighters, the garage fighter and then the monster fighter, the racquetball fighter, the pool fighter, the Scottish fighter, and then Attila, and I defeated them all easily, but I knew they weren't the real fighters. They were the calm before the storm, and then eventually Jack the Ripper showed up looking for me just like the librarian did, and he began fighting me using all his powers, and then I said, fascinating, you're very good at using weapons, but I noticed you don't like to use your hands much and maybe should learn. You still have not struck me yet and you're pathetic, Jack, and it's become painfully obvious you're no match for me. And then Jack the Ripper panicked and he kept trying to slash at me, and then I asked Jack the Ripper, do you know what my martial arts technique is? It's called Ultra Instinct and it allows me to dodge without thinking, and evasion has become an instinct to me and you will never win, Jack. And then he said, then kill me, stop toying with me. And then I said, throw me a knife and let me show you how it's really done. And then Jack said, fine, you can have one of my best knives. And then I said, you and the rest of the people that did the Hercules method training, you have all become arrogant and complacent, and the rest of you don't understand what the Hercules method was meant for. It was meant to unleash humanity's true power, and even if it's the last thing I do, I will make sure that everyone on Earth reads that book. And then he said, no, I thought you were going to sell it for $40. And then I said, I am for a little while, but eventually and probably really soon the price will go down because people need to embrace what they were truly meant to be, and the librarian knew that this could not be hidden forever, and there's still many humans that will choose not to do it. They will choose not to be killers like me or you, and that doesn't mean they are a waste, it means they are better than us. You are but the first in a long line of very old killers, and my target is Cain, not you. You're just in my way. And I said all of this while I was dodging all of Jack the Ripper's attacks, and then Jack the Ripper asked me, why can't I hit you, and what the hell are you? And then I said, I am the king of the jungle, I am a lion among men, I am Lionheart, and I am the strongest warrior on this planet. And then I moved so fast across the battlefield that Jack the Ripper couldn't see me, and then I cut his body into small pieces using just a knife, and then I knew who would come next. After I killed Jack the Ripper, I destroyed his body with my perfect sentry powers, and then the next day Miyamoto Musashi showed up at my door and he spoke fluent English, but I knew who he was soon as I saw him, and then I said his name, so it's you, Miyamoto Musashi. And then he asked me, you know who I am and why I'm here? And then I said yes, but I'd rather not fight you in my house, instead I'd rather fight you somewhere in a forest or maybe somewhere near Japan's countryside. And then he said, oh yes, then follow me, Lionheart. And then I asked him, so are you here to kill me like the others? And then Miyamoto Musashi said, heavens no, I'm not like the others, I'm more curious about you than anything else, because they all said you're the most powerful of all the people that learned the Hercules method training, and they even said you have powers on the level of a god. And then I said you should listen to them because the people you heard that from are telling the truth. And then me and Miyamoto Musashi walked to a nearby forest, and then he said, right here is good enough because this place reminds me a bit of my home in Japan. And then I asked, tell me, have you ever fought an unarmed combatant? And then Musashi said, no, and that's one reason why I don't want to kill you. And then I said, well, you might want to reconsider that. And then Miyamoto Musashi started using psychic cutting technique, but in his mind I always dodged him and I always cut off his head using my hands, or I always injured him enough to immobilize him by cutting all his muscles and tendons at lightning speed. And then for the first time in his life Musashi Miyamoto felt threatened by an unarmed man, and then he said, no, it's impossible, no one is that fast. And then Miyamoto Musashi jumped at me with his sword, and then I disarmed using ancient technique. I took away his sword and I used his own sword and momentum against him, and now Miyamoto Musashi was standing in front of me with his own sword at his throat. And then Miyamoto Musashi bowed down to me and he asked me, you were trained by Shaolin monks, weren't you? And then I said, yes, I definitely was, but I did my own special type of training, and it wasn't the Hercules method, but it was a type of training that breaks a human's mortal limits.